From Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals to Agenda 63 in Africa and national policies, the world is not short of policies. What is short of is policy implementation. On this platform and today on this episode, we get to delve deep into how policies can contribute significantly to the creation of green jobs. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacobs Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. In season 1 of Green Jobs Africa, we covered a specific episode where we touched on the progression of how climate action became a global concern and a global goal. And in today's episode, we're going to take a bit of a recap to build up from the Millennium Development Goals to where we find ourselves today, where many countries have developed specific policies to address the issue of climate. As we discussed in that previous episode, we touched on how the Millennium Development Goals were crafted. And that was when in about 2000, 189 countries came together to decide on specific goals that needed to be achieved by the world. It was more of like painting a vision for the world, outlining specific goals that the world would be able to work on. And they identified 8 specific goals that were supposed to be the convergence around which the global development agenda would then be centered. Goal 7 of those 8 goals was the issue of environmental sustainability. If you look at most of those goals, for example, Goal 1 and Goal 2, they were talking about halving the issue of poverty and hunger in the world. And progressively, in 2012, there was then a convergence in Rio to be able to review where the world had reached as far as the Millennium Development Goals were concerned. Remember that this goal set in 2000 was supposed to then have been given a 15-year timeline within which they could be achieved. And so in 2012, that convergence in Rio was a review to find out where exactly has the world arrived at, what needs to be done, and how then can we move more strategically towards achievement of those goals. And it's in that meeting that then the decision to make sure that there was an expansion of those goals from 8 Millennium Development Goals to 17 Sustainable Development Goals was crafted. And that was then launched later on, where there was an initial outlining of the specific goals that the world would then work towards. In the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that started off in 2015, Goal 13 stipulates that climate action would then be at the center stage of the world in terms of addressing the issue of environmental sustainability. If you are like me and you spend time, crafting goals for yourself or outlining exactly where you want to be and being able to figure out how far you've come in life and the things that you need to adjust and what needs to be done, it was obvious that this particular exercise also needed to be done at a global level. And so when the Sustainable Development Goals were crafted began in 2015, remember that this was an expansion of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. And the idea was, how do we then make this a bit clearer for everyone to work on more specific objectives? For example, the one about eradicating hunger initially had been crafted as halving hunger across the world. And then in the Sustainable Development Goals, it was changed to eradicating hunger. You're probably wondering, what does this have to do with the topic of green jobs, but we'll get there, don't worry. And so in 2015, like I mentioned, there was then another 15-year plan that was captured in the Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, 2023, was the midterm of those 15 years. And the idea was a review of the Sustainable Development Goals to figure out, are we really making progress? And this is the punchline. Out of all the 17 goals, only 2 seems to have a semblance of progress. And climate change was not one of them. In fact, climate change was one of those that was in the red, meaning that we're not making enough progress to be able to actually move closer to that goal that had been set before. But that's at a global level. You're probably wondering, how does this affect Africa and how does this affect you as a young person in Africa? Now, some of those goals have been captured in other global or other continental documents. For example, our Agenda 63, which is the African vision of what we want to achieve. And if you look at Aspiration 1, out of the 7 aspirations that are captured in the Agenda 63, you'll realize that at the very bottom of Aspiration 1 is a clear stipulation of a determination to safeguard, for example, the carbon sinks, land restoration processes, creation of jobs in terms of making sure that there's progress progressive action taken towards addressing the issue of climate change in Africa. Last year, we also captured the detailed review of the Nairobi Declaration, which was the first time when African countries came together to break down specifically what they wanted to do in order to achieve climate action objectives that they had set for themselves, as opposed to agendas that had been set for them by other people. Now, if you tracked with me from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, there's Agenda 63, and there are other many policies that have then been crafted, not necessarily from Agenda 63, but specifically from Sustainable Development Goals. For example, the carbon regulations in Kenya is one of those offshoots of the specific focus on climate change globally, which has been cascaded down to Kenya. And as you would note, if you've been following the progress since the Nairobi Declaration, a lot of the countries around, for example, Rwanda and many others, are coming up with their own policies around carbon markets regulations. There are many other policies that have come up, especially in Kenya. We are blessed with lots of policies, if I was to put it that way. There are many policies around land restoration. There are many policies around e-mobility that are still in the process of being formulated, and many more. I could go on and on. My point is, we're not short of policies. What we are short of is policy implementation. As someone who's worked in government before, I know too well how many policies government has to deal with, especially in terms of formulation, and then having to rally so many other stakeholders to be able to address the issue or to implement the policies on the ground. An example which we will delve into in a subsequent episode is the waste management policy. For example, we in Kenya, like our neighbors in Rwanda, Uganda, Tanzania, banned the use of single-use plastic bags in Kenya or in the region. But the truth is, beyond the policy and the initial drive that was there, not much has really changed on the ground, which means it's very possible to have documents in theoretical format, but not have that captured in the reality of the lives of the people that are actually supposed to be benefiting from some of these policies. And if you were to look at some of the policies that I've mentioned, for example, the carbon markets regulations, if we were to mention that, for example, in Kenya, this was formulated last year and passed and assented to, and it's one of those policies that, if captured, could really address the issue of job creation in Kenya, because there's a way that then communities and especially young people would benefit in terms of from the carbon credits, but also from the projects that they would get involved in. The policy stipulates that there would be a retention of the money that is then generated from carbon credits within the communities. And obviously, part of it is retained by the government, meaning that there's more circulation of the funds, or rather the communities will be able to benefit, and there'll be jobs that are created and sustainable livelihoods. But this is not It's still being monitored to see how it will be implemented, because obviously in some of these policies, there could be a bit of teething issues here and there. As I mentioned earlier, things like land restoration, things like e-mobility, they're new and amazing opportunities, especially for Africa. If you look at e-mobility in particular, Africa holds more than or about 30% of the world's critical minerals deposits, some of which is very critical when it comes to solar panels, as well as batteries that are used in e-mobility in terms of the e-vehicles. And yet, we are not anywhere when it comes to creation of green jobs in the e-mobility sector. In fact, it's a very nascent sector to the point that it's just emerging. And you'll hear some of these details in a subsequent episode when we'll be talking to a man who's been in this space for a while, and trying to create e-mobility or trying to create jobs in the e-mobility space. But this is my point. We are far from being able to reap the benefits of the resources that we have, and even the policies that have been captured in terms of documents. And so today, part of my reflection has been, why exactly is there a huge gap between policy formulation or policy documentation and implementation? And this is my conclusion, that there's a difference between formulating policy, and that's usually done by technocrats, academicians, researchers, and policy experts, if I was to put it that way. And most of this is done, yes, in consultation with different stakeholders, but it remains a document for the most part. When it comes to policy implementation, that requires leadership. And for us at Jacob's Ladder, it's one of the mindsets that we call agile grit, meaning that you have to be flexible enough to implement something, but you have to be determined to implement something, and then flexible enough to be able to adapt to the changing circumstances and seasons that come along the way in the process of implementing the policy. And that's one of the things that's been lacking, because if you've listened to me before, you'd hear me say this very often, that climate change is a leadership issue, meaning that while there are many opportunities across various sectors, whether it's in the health sector, or in the education sector, or in the agriculture sector, it takes leadership, determined leadership, to be able to translate vision, in this case captured in policies, all the way to actual practical benefits on the ground. And then in Africa, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many gaps and many, many opportunities that we could be able to leverage, but we do need to be able to move beyond the theoretical into the practical. And that's part of the reason why, as Jacob's Ladder Africa, we wanted to move away from the theory, because we did do quite a bit of that, being able to share our views and just educating you on what climate change is all about. But in this episode, we thought, let's talk about the practical. Let's find those people who are actually doing something on the ground. And while some policies are there, some policies may be missing, but the point is, even as we continue to document more policies, we definitely do need a lot of translation of policy into practical action. One of the other gaps that I've noticed in my work previously in government and now working in the development sector is that there's a huge gap when it comes to understanding and communication of policies. For example, there are many ideas and many a lot of resources that are spent on creation and formulation of policy. But when it comes to the communication of those policies to the people who would ideally benefit or even play a role in achieving the objectives, for the most part, it's lacking. And that's why sometimes you can tell that when something is not known, then the people who are supposed to be playing a role to make sure it's achieved don't actually play their role. And therefore, the purpose for which it was created in the first place does not happen. Finally, I think that at the end of the day, when it comes to policy implementation, it has to be a joint effort. Private sector, public sector, the development world, everyone has a role to play, but it has to be coordinated in a very seamless format. And that's one of the things that we as Jacob's Ladder intend to continue to do, at least in our home ground right now in Kenya, and with other willing partners across the continent, to be able to find a way of harmonizing the creation of green jobs on the one hand, but also the development of green skills on the other. Because, for example, with every policy, and there are opportunities that will come up with maybe, say, the carbon markets regulation or even the e-mobility space, and jobs will be created, there still has to be the development of the skills required to be able to achieve the objectives of the policy. I hope you understand, and I hope you can see the point that I'm trying to make today, is that we are not short of policies, we are not short of goals, we are not short of ideas captured in documents, we're not short of even research papers and evidence that there's need to do something. What we are short of is bold leadership to be able to execute, to drive the implementation of these policies all the way to the ground at the grassroots level. We will continue to review some of the specific policies, and in the subsequent episode, we will capture specifically the plastic ban in the East African region in Africa. How has that actually panned out? You know, many of them were banned, believe it or not, in 2007, 2008, most recently in Kenya in 2017. But how has that actually been effected on the ground? Because the ban had a great reason and motive, but at the end of the day, if it's not effected or enforced, it remains just a paper. Please continue to share your views. What are some of the policies that your countries are implementing? What are some of the policies you admire from other countries? What are some of those things that you think require a policy to be put in place? Or what are some of the policies that you know that you've not been able to see implementation within your respective countries? Thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope to hear from you. Please do share, like, comment in the comment section below. Let us know what you think. What are some of the policies that you like, that you're hearing, that your governments are developing, or that you hear that neighboring countries have developed and you'd think that your country should adopt them? Or are there policies in your countries that you'd love to see actual implementation? We'd love to hear from you. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.